On today's episode of Bytes and Banter, we're joined by Sarah Nicastro, top 25 HDI thought leader, principal evangelist at IFS, and host of the Unscripted podcast. How you doing today, Sarah?
I'm good, Rocky. How are you?
Let's go ahead and start by asking you just to share a little bit about your journey, like share
hmm
about your career journey, kind of how you came to be this role of principal evangelist and start this podcast and share with the audience who maybe doesn't know you as well, kind of what that journey was like.
It was less intentional than anyone may expect. A little bit of falling into things and finding my way as I went. But when I was in grad school, I ran into a friend who was working for a local publishing company and recommended that I take a look and apply for a role. So I did. I actually applied initially for a sales position. I don't even think they gave me the benefit of officially declining. They just, did nothing. And I followed up and they told me that they weren't really interested because I didn't have prior experience. And I was very, very persistent in continuing to follow up. And I think, they got quite tired of me and they eventually agreed to give me an interview, probably just to pacify me. And ultimately told me they didn't feel I was right for a sales role, but that they had a writing position open and asked if I would be interested in that. And I said, sure. And so I started writing case studies for what was then Integrated Solutions Magazine, later became Field Technologies Magazine. And I spent about 12 years there. I became the editor-in-chief when that publication was rebranded to Field Technologies. So, what started off as just wanting to, get into a grown-up job, turned into, really just entering into the services space at a time where there was a lot of interesting things happening. I didn't know what field service was when I took that role. Quickly started to figure it out and piece things together, but it just happened to be a time where there were a lot of really interesting shifts taking place, how service was perceived, obviously digital transformation. And I just got really interested in it and stuck around for quite a while. In 2018, not long after Darren Roos joined IFS as the CEO, a woman named Marnie Martin, who had been in the service management space and we knew each other, reached out to me about coming into IFS, but specifically to launch and run a thought leadership resource, which I still do today, and that's called Future of Field Service. So I left my post in publishing and came over to the technology provider side, but still doing a lot of what I did before. Added the podcast in April of 2019. And so am able to have a lot of very interesting conversations there. So I run Future of Field Service. I host the weekly podcast. And then the idea of being a principal evangelist at IFS is really just about taking a lot of the things that work well in media, the approach of interviewing and storytelling and how to define topics that people are interested in, how to share stories in a way people want to take part in, and just bringing that into the IFS marketing organization as well to help support the business and tell customer stories and all sorts of great things.
Quite a journey from
hmm
master's, student to, hey, I want to do sales. No, you're not right fit writing. And who would have known that no led to a yes that would lead you to where you're at now?
Yeah, yeah.
It's such a cool story. I think you don't have to share it all the details if you don't want, but you told a story about that call you got the first time you were working with a technology leader and
hmm
doing a study for them
Yeah.
and kind of the impact, right, of learning. Because you came in at a time when, man, things were very different than the world you live in today.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's crazy to even think about. I mean, it just makes me sound old to think about how different things were, even in the creative process, how
Yeah.
no one was doing video calls. We were all just on phone calls. We back in the day used to physically transcribe all of our interviews. You're talking about, I mean, honestly, a big bulk of my early career was
Yeah.
running a print publication, like writing cover stories and organizing photo shoots. And, I loved it, but it is very different. The story that you brought up was actually the very first interview-based story I ever wrote. I scheduled the interview. I was very respectful that the person I was talking to, was busy and they were making time to do this case study. And he launched right into, the technology they had deployed and why they had done it. And he was using every other word was an acronym. I didn't know what any of them meant. I
Yeah.
was, green is an understatement, but I didn't want to seem so green. And I was afraid to not, I was embarrassed that I didn't know what he was saying. So I just kind of listened and said, right. And then when I wrote the story, there wasn't a whole lot to it because I hadn't understood a good portion of what the gentleman had said. And I turned it into the copy editor and he threw it back at me and was like, "What is this?" And I'm like, "Oh, well, and he said, "You need to do it over." So I had to call him back and say, "Hey, actually, I don't know any of these acronyms and I need you to kind of take it from the top, but I'm going to ask you way more questions." So that was a very humbling experience, but it also was a good way to learn very early on that to tell a story well, you have to really understand that.
Mm.
You have to really understand it. And so, if someone back then it was acronyms, but even today, if someone makes a statement to me about a goal they have or a problem they're trying to solve, and it's, something to do with their industry that I don't fully understand, or it's just in the weeds in a way that, is above my head, I just will say, "I don't really know what you mean. Can you explain that better?" And it helps me do a good job of telling stories because I make sure that I know what they mean before I try and create anything from it. So,
No, I love that, and I think there's a lesson there for anybody in any role, right? Whether you're in service desk, field services, you're in leadership, curiosity goes a lot further in your ability to serve a customer than assumption,
mhm.
right? Now, you're in this role of principal evangelist. You've done unscripted podcasts, the future of field services. Now, when we were talking, what was interesting is something you said to me that I didn't really catch it. And it was similar in the sense that I didn't understand until you explained it, that, hey, the future of field services isn't just about that desk side field technician.
Mhm.
Right? Can you walk for those who haven't maybe tuned in and encourage you guys to tune in to all
Yeah.
that Sarah's doing, but what are you looking at when you talk about field services? Like what all goes into that?
Yeah, it's a really good point because if you even think back to, so 2008 is when I took that first role. At that time, and in some ways, we still talk about the need to eliminate silos, right? But at that time, to your point, things were far different, and so there was a lot of discussion specifically about field service and service transformation and is field service a cost center or could it be a potential profit center? Things like this, right? And over time, I mean, just the nature of how things have progressed, with focus on customer experience and the customer journey, there's no way any longer to really separate out a conversation about just field service because it's
Mm,
too tied to the customer experience and also the rest of the business, right? I mean, companies are not doing a good job if they're thinking about just field service and just this, right? There has to be, cross collaboration and an overarching strategy. And so, what we talk about at Future of Field Service, I always say field service and beyond, right? Because these things are all relevant to field service. They're also relevant to service leaders. You don't really, I mean, you see some people that are in charge of just field service, but a lot of service leaders have responsibility for field service and the call center and technical support and, a number of different functions. So it's relevant to those folks, but a lot of the things that we're talking about are really relevant to business leaders in general. When we're talking about things that, you know, you can't just separate out, right? So we're talking about talent and what that landscape looks like. We're talking about upskilling and reskilling as AI, gets more deeply embedded into processes. We're talking about keeping pace with digital transformation. We're talking about how services evolving and how customer expectations are changing. So all of these things that we discuss, we're often looking at through the lens of a service leader, but they are often conversations that are, applicable in many, many areas of the business.
No, I love that, just beating down silos, right? Just this idea that the conversations we have should be focused on outcome,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that impacts every part of the business, whether you're a financial leader, HR leader, you're a service desk leader, a field technician leader, and it all
Mm-hmm.
does overlap. And you guys are adding a lot of value and really breaking down that barrier through those conversations, despite the name and the traditional thought of, oh, field services. No, it's so much bigger than that. So I love that you call that out.
Yeah.
Um,
Thank you.
One thing that is, really common in IT, in technology and business, is change,
Mm-hmm.
right? You just talked about AI.
Mm-hmm.
It's coming, right? Now, some organizations are moving quicker than others. And, there's some thoughts I have on that and some perceptions, right? And I think you
Mm-hmm.
kind of hit on some of them around, we have to focus on the experience first, right? The human element is so critical to
Mm-hmm.
drive better outcomes.
Yeah.
I'd be curious to know, as you've grown your career, as you've seen just the waves of technology change. 2008 is a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
I won't say how old I was in 2008, but a lot of changes happened.
Yeah,
What
for
are
sure.
what are those lessons that you kind of see permeating, that, like, man, these are things that everybody needs to know?
Well, there's so many, right? Because I could answer that question almost two different ways, like change in general or AI specifically, right?
Yeah.
So I think, you know, the thing about change is it's a constant, but it's also picked up in pace and in velocity, right? And I think that can be really hard
Mhm.
for business leaders because it's like, you never kind of cross a real finish line. It's like as soon as you make some progress, something else changes. And then, you maybe sort this one thing out and then something else changes. And it is just the reality. But I think, you know, change is also the area that is the hardest. So it's also the area, as I've interviewed, it has to be thousands of business leaders at this point. It's very commonly the area where things went wrong, where,
Mhm.
the wheels fall off, right?
Mhm.
It's because it's a human response to not want to change. I mean, change is
Yeah.
hard for human beings, right? And so I think, a lot of it is just being conscious of that and planning for it instead of just crossing your fingers that it won't come or it won't be as bad as you think it will. Or, all too often, change management is what gets cut from budgets, rushed through, and you pay for that,
Mhm.
time and time over if you try and, take shortcuts. So you're better off just acknowledging that it's human nature to resist change, and it's well worth the time, money, and effort to put into getting ahead of it. And I think with the pace of change what it is today, one of the conversations we've been having a lot is sort of change management remains important, but change leadership is becoming more important. And what that means is, not just managing change as you would with a project focused plan to make sure that you're training and enabling people to learn something new, but also creating cultures where people feel that they are able to contribute, that they have a voice, that they
Mhm.
are appreciated, all of these things. So it's something that, you don't have the luxury anymore of, having a project and then, okay, in another 3 to 5 years, we'll do this again and we'll apply these lessons we've learned next time, right? It's just one after
Yeah.
another. So, the focus has to be a bit more woven into company culture instead of something that we only think about programmatically.
You actually answered the question that was popping in my head. Like, how do you, is this a cultural thing, right? Because as I hear you talking, it almost sounds like the role of OCM, organizational change management, is important, but it's more important to ingrain that in the culture. And I'd be curious to hear you flesh that out a little bit. Like,
Hmm.
what does a successful, organizations that have this embedded in their culture because change isn't stopping and it's only speeding up, what does that
Hmm.
look like?
So I don't have a template, but what I can tell you is there's a reason it's the hardest part.
Yeah.
Because it's really, I think, something that is hard to define in the sense that there isn't necessarily one right way
Hmm.
to do it. I think that what's happening. So I was at the Field Service Palm Springs event in April, and Sarah from Waters Corporation was presenting, talking about their AI initiative, but she was talking about ADKAR and
Yep.
how common it is that people skip over awareness and desire. They go on to the next steps, and they usually also skip after reinforcement, right? And I think it's a really good way to think about where we are today and what needs to change, because historically, I think leaders have had the ability to be pretty lazy in skipping over awareness and desire, and just based on the makeup of the talent landscape, right? They could go right to, here's what's changing, here's what we need you to do, here's your training, go do it. And,
Yeah.
they would have some success. That doesn't work anymore. So,
Mm.
thinking about how do we create that awareness and that desire brings us back to leadership and emotional intelligence and things that are a lot harder to pin down in, the way that you're asking. Like, well, like, what's the blueprint for success? I think it's people that really care.
Mm.
And I think it's people that genuinely believe and are empowered by leaders who also believe that if you treat people well, you will get better results. There's a lot of things that make that piece the sticky piece in so many examples.
We could spend a whole episode, an hour, just talking about that piece, right? Because leadership is sticky. But I think you're spot on, right? The tactics look different across different organizations, right? And leaders who genuinely care about their people and their well-being and their ability to be productive in a way that is meaningful for them to drive better outcomes are going to ask those questions, right? Hey, is this working? Is this something you even want? Do you need this, right? It's like assuming an application is crap but not asking the people using the application, like, why did you make that assumption, right? And why are we making that change? And I love that. It's really, really good stuff. What other lessons do you have for us, Sarah? What other lessons? Most of us aren't inclined to be natural communicators,
Hmm.
right? So how does an IT leader, a technology leader, how do they tell a meaningful story to their customer, to their internal stakeholders? Like, what goes
Yeah.
into a meaningful story?
Well, like we talked about a little bit ago, I think telling a meaningful story has to start with being curious, right?
Mm,
Because, you've, I'm sure, heard the term or the statement, are you listening to understand or are you listening to respond, right? So it's
yeah.
the same concept. If you're trying to tell a story without any understanding of who you ultimately want to have consume that story, then, your chances of success are relatively small. You need to understand, what is it that my intended audience cares about? What's important
Mm,
to them? Then you can start to craft a story that they will find compelling. And I think in the business context, a lot of times what we're really trying to do is to get someone to understand our side, or to get someone to understand, why we need budget for something, why we want to change something, why, whatever it is. And so again, understanding who am I going to be sharing this story with? Who am I going to be talking to? And, what is important to them? How can I frame, what I'm going to share in a way that will resonate with them? And also thinking about, communication style and, their personality, your personality, like you said, if I know it's really hard for me to present, I need to take that into consideration. If I know that they're this personality, I need to take that into consideration. So I guess it's research and curiosity are very helpful. And then, really trying to stay organized, stay relatively concise. I think one of the things that makes storytelling powerful is that it evokes emotion. So thinking
Mm,
about, if I know what's important to them and I know what I'm trying to say, how can I evoke emotion? How can I get them to care about what I'm sharing or the impact of what I'm sharing? And, having some form of a conclusion, so if that's an ask or,
yeah.
whatever it might be. But a lot of times it's getting out of our own way. It's the idea of, applying principles that we've all learned in our own lives and just thinking about how to apply those same things in a professional setting.
And it's interesting as you talk about that. The reality is you can tell the same story to three different audiences and you'll tell it differently,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether you're trying to get someone to buy a product or to adopt the usage of a product or to change a process, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who you're telling really matters and knowing your audience. And I think that loops right back to the leadership thing. Like, do you really care?
Yeah, it's all well, that's what I was going to say. It's also about authenticity, right?
Yeah.
Because the term storytelling gets used in a lot of different ways, right? But a
Yeah.
presentation is not storytelling. You know what I mean? There's a big difference, and I think that emotion piece is part of it. Are you evoking emotion, but also, do you believe in what you're saying, right? If you're just checking a box by sharing information on X, Y, and Z because your boss told you have to or whatever, like that's going to make it pretty tough to have the impact that you would if you genuinely care and you're invested in what it is that you're speaking about.
We support a very large hospital network where I work, and we it's very easy to say we reset passwords, we make sure Epic is running. But I remember there was a story that we tell because it was so impactful, and I think you're spot on with the emotions and thinking about service desk, right? So if you're listening to this, you're in service desk. Depending on industry you're in, it'll look different. But we had a service desk agent who like literally just said, "Hey, I just saved a life." Like what? No, I reset a password for somebody who is in the ER admitting someone into the hospital, and I
Mm-hmm.
literally just saved a life. Like those things are so much more meaningful, and I
Yeah.
think as leaders, it's so critical that you're doing that consistently to tell your team how they're adding value, not just metrics, right?
Mm-hmm.
How are you making a meaningful impact? Because that gets people excited,
Mm-hmm.
right? It
For
gets them
sure.
excited about what they're doing.
And that's, the other context of this, right? Is there's storytelling is an art form that you can use any which way. If you're
Yeah.
presenting up, if you're speaking to a peer, if you're sharing something with your teams, if you kind of focus yourself on, some of those things, what does this person care about? How can I make this impactful? Right. And I think, you know, what you just said is maybe I said concise earlier. Maybe it's not necessarily concise, but it's clear and it's simple, right? It's
Yeah.
something that people can latch on to. And going back to the human parts, to your point, most people want to feel that what they do every day makes a difference. And a
Yeah.
lot of the ways that leaders can help people remember that impact and make them feel valued and important. They don't cost a lot of money. They're not complicated or complex. They're just not done enough, and that's why when you were asking about, what does it take to lead well when we were talking about change, it's tough because it's it's these characteristics that you can say and they sound simple, but they're far harder to execute, right? Like it's in the nuance of how it's done and in the authenticity and all of those things that make the difference.
Yeah, it's hard to lead well when you don't truly believe that people matter or purpose matters, and you no desire to be persistent, right? And those two things, servant leadership, something I'm obsessed with, and those are the fundamentals, right?
It's also hard to lead well when you work for people
Mm,
that believe people aren't important.
mm,
And that I see that more often, right? Like I talk to people that want to do better, they see this potential, but they are working in organizations where at the top, some of the good change that they might like to impart is just not going to fly because those beliefs aren't shared and that culture isn't there. I think that's changing, but it'll take time.
that's hard. It's a hard place to be when I think I saw an article. I think Metric Sherpa maybe shared it with Justin Robbins and Nate Brown around sometimes the hardest role is being the person in the room who cares.
Hmm.
Right, who wants to
Yeah.
make a meaningful difference, and, it can be frustrating at times. It can be
Hmm.
frustrating. So
Yeah.
change, the rapid change, the intentionality around the things, what other are those lessons? I know we talked about maybe top 3, or what other
Hmm.
things do you feel like you've learned that anybody, whether it's IT support, leadership, can really gain and take home and say, "Hey, this is meaningful." What are those
Yeah.
things?
So we talked about one, which is the power of curiosity. And I would say that can't be underscored because in the business realm, it is incredible how many people are just on their own agenda all of the time. And I think that if you can step back and just be a bit curious and understand people a bit better, you learn a lot, and you may learn that your agenda actually isn't the right agenda. But if that's not the case and your agenda remains the right agenda, having taken the time to be curious and understand people a little bit better is going to put you in a much better position to ultimately achieve what is on your agenda. So it's just, I think, a great skill. And I think also in the era of change that we were speaking about, there is always so much to learn. And I think people that are curious, they're also the people that are reading books, listening to podcasts, wanting to understand different perspectives. They're hungry for knowledge. They're not just resting in the false confidence that everything they know is all there is to know, right? So that's one. The second one I would say is to be yourself and to believe in yourself. So this was going back to sort of early lessons in my career. So a lot of times now when I speak at events, which I do very often, inevitably people will come up to me afterwards and be like, "You were so good. Like, you're so good at speaking. You're so comfortable on stage." And I'm like, "Thank you." It wasn't always this way though, right? Like, I remember some very painful early experiences of just bombing. And it all really traced back to the false belief that if I were going to be presenting, that meant I needed to be the smartest person at the event. Otherwise, they would have never asked me to get on stage. And so then I would get in my own head about the fact that, like, I knew I wasn't the smartest person, right, at the event. And so it just, at some point, after enough times of doing it inauthentically, I just let it all go and decided, you know what? I'm just going to show up and talk about what I know and what I care about. And hopefully that'll work better. And lo and behold, like that was all it took. Right. So it's like,
Yeah.
if you just, I think what's key here is that no one is as smart as they seem on LinkedIn or, in a meeting, right? Like everyone is smart about some things and everyone is not smart about everything. So it's not a competition, right? It's a collective effort, right? So at an event, they don't want the singular smartest person in the room to be giving every session. They want a collection of voices to speak about their areas of passion or expertise, and people take from that. So, it's this idea of you don't have to know everything, you don't have to be good at everything, but you need to be very passionate about what it is that you do know and that you are good at, and then just focus on doing that well, and lean into what is you and let go of what you think people want you to be or what you think you should be, etc. I think there's a couple other areas that same theme plays out. One is, I think it's really important to follow your intuition.
Mm.
Easier said than done. And I say that because I am just incredibly outspoken and I will say what I think no matter what. And I understand not everyone is that way, and I've also tried to mature and learn myself, and I don't fight every battle anymore. I really have tried to check my own ego and understand okay, well, we could do it this way or that way, but I'm just going to let this one go, But if you are in a situation where you're really biting your tongue because you feel like your voice doesn't matter, or what if so-and-so at this level thinks that I shouldn't have said, I think, to your point earlier about leadership, I think we have too many yes men in the corporate world. We have too many people that will sit in a meeting and just nod and smile, not because they agree, but because they don't want to ruffle feathers. They don't want to, take the path less chosen. They want to win the gold stars and get a pat on the back from the CEO or whatever. And I think we need more people who are willing to respectfully question things. And that goes back to being you. If there's something that your spidey senses are telling you to speak up about, or, I don't think this is right for me, really listen to that voice.
So that's really good. Let me ask you a question on that, because when I hear you talking about your intuition, your spidey senses, right? There's times when, as leaders, we create one of two things, right? We either create a place of transparency that leads to hope in a future that is not real yet, that we want to help create, or we lead to a place which I would think falls in the yes men category of fear, where I'm not going to say anything because this is the way it is, right? How can leaders recognize if they've created an environment where there's not that ability for their teams to come to them and say no or question a decision? How can you recognize that if you're been leading for a long time or a while, you're just in leadership? How do you make sure that you're looking for signs that say, hey, there's hope and transparency and people have the ability to, the way I love that you word it is have their own voice while also making a meaningful impact in the business. How do you make sure you're doing that well?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest indication would be if you're not having any of those conversations, right? If everyone's just saying, yes, yes, absolutely, Rocky, I'll go get that done, no questions, then probably they're not comfortable questioning you. And to be completely honest, I think not all, but many of the leaders who don't have that dynamic wouldn't want it. They're the leaders that don't really want people questioning them, right? And so the people that do, I think more often than not, will naturally create that, if that makes sense. I think because it really comes back to valuing people. And I think the other thing it brings to mind for me is I think that there's been, a real shift in leadership in the last 10 years, we'll say. Many, but one of them specifically is that leaders have had to be humbled in the sense of there is no more opportunity to just lead because you are the smartest or you just know the most. That won't get you success in today's landscape, because leadership today is about curating a lot of different skill sets and orchestrating them and empowering them to work together toward a common goal. So that's really hard to do if you've curated a group of people that feel their opinions don't matter and they can't question anything that you're directing them to do. It's almost what you're saying is, you know what I mean? Almost inherently at odds with how a leader who values other people's opinions would lead, if that makes sense. But the other thing I would say on your original question is just to ask.
Yeah.
Like, if you are a leader who really does question, like, okay, I do value people's opinions, but maybe for a bunch of different reasons, I haven't been giving people a chance to speak up or to contribute, just start. Like, just
Yeah.
start. And at that, and understand that if you haven't been doing it, you're not going to all of a sudden ask the question one time and have 10 people chiming in. You're going to need to start doing it at every meeting, at every interaction. What do you think? I would really like to hear your opinion, and give people a chance to realize, like, okay, he's still asking, like maybe he actually wants to hear my opinion, right? And also the way you react to people like myself that maybe are more inclined to push back or ask hard questions also matters, right? If we're in a meeting and I say something and you dismiss it really quickly, the next person isn't going to share what they want to share. I just interviewed a gentleman, Michael Potts from ACO recently, and he said to me, I feel that my job here as a leader is to challenge the status quo, and I don't understand how I could possibly do that well if I don't invite everyone to challenge me. And
Mm,
I was like, that's it. Like,
mm,
because that collectively you're better than just your opinion, right? Or just your
yeah.
view on what should be done or how.
No, I love that. And I think, leaders naturally are going to get more pro- productivity, better outcomes, however you want to word it, if they start by asking the question, right? Here's the
Mm-hmm.
problem. What do you guys think? How can we
Mm-hmm.
solve it? Because they have an idea in the back of their head. Every leader does, or you wouldn't be a leader, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But man, when you go to your team and you ask that question, like, what do you guys think we should do about this? Like, how can we address
Mm-hmm.
this? And you start there, and that becomes the starting place. You
Mm-hmm.
find, at least in my experience, 9 times out of 10, either they have the answer you had in the back of your head, or they have better answers to the
Mm-hmm.
problem because they're on the ground doing it,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
And you're only as good as the lessons you're willing to learn.
Mm-hmm.
Embrace failure, right? So I think those are really, really good points, Sarah. So that's two. Do you have a
Yeah.
third?
The third was just the power of community. And so I think, this can mean different things to different people depending on what role you're in and maybe what industry, what have you. But, I think that I'm in a unique position to have had the opportunity to meet and continue to meet so many truly incredible people. And I don't talk to these people one time and then never talk to them again or never think about them again. I mean, there's many of those people that I continue to interact with on a regular basis that I can call to ask questions or, you know, um, ask for help if I need it, and I think that this idea of, tapping into the power of community, going to events and engaging with people, finding peer groups to be a part of, and, just working through things with people or commiserating with people or celebrating with people, is really powerful. And, I just was thinking the other day, when I posted about my new title, and I read each and every comment that came in, and there were so many of them that like it truly warmed my heart to read them. Like they're people from all different phases of my career journey that mean a lot to me, and I think
Yeah.
that sometimes we don't put enough effort or energy or time because it can be challenging into just, you know, spending time with others, learning from others, helping and trusting that, if you put good out into the world, it will come back to you, that sort of thing.
It's funny, the Surgeon General issued a epidemic notice last, I think it was late last year, that loneliness is worse for your health than smoking 15 packs of cigarettes a day, than lack of exercise and obesity, right? It increases your risk of death and heart attack and stroke immensely more than all those
Mm-hmm.
things that initially seem bad, right? Your health is bad if you do these things, or these things are true. Yet, how how true is it that we live in a more isolated world than we ever have,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's a serious problem. And I think as you're talking about that, for me, there's been a number of times in my recent journey that this echoes true for me where it's like, hey, I need to process something. I'm going to call Roy Atkinson,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or I'm going to call somebody I know from HDI, and as we're HDILocal Chapters podcast, it's just so appropriate and so fitting
Mm-hmm.
that you just call that out. Like, I was writing a review this week for Support World Live, and one of my comments was, I will never miss this because of the people unless I have no
Mm-hmm.
other option. If I have a child being born or graduating, sure, I'll
Yeah.
miss it, or a funeral. But if I can make it happen, I'm going to be here because the people that you connect with have so much impact in your work, outside of work. So I love
Mm-hmm.
that. I love that that's your third. Because for
Yeah.
me, it's such a huge one that can be neglected. Can be neglected. People don't talk about it.
Yeah.
Community's critical.
My husband makes fun of me every year at my birthday because I get more messages on LinkedIn than I do like Facebook or, he's
Yeah.
like, that's so lame. I'm like, I don't know. I love these people. It is what it is.
Yeah. Well,
So,
and it's
yeah.
funny because Sarah, you say that, but I think it echoes the reality that you get back what you put in
Mm-hmm.
into the community, right? There's
Yeah,
a
for
reason you're a
sure.
top 25 thought leader, right? There's a reason that you have that engagement, and it's not to blow smoke, but genuinely, you're making a tangible impact. All those people who comment, you've made an impact enough that they're stopping, pausing for 20 seconds to say, "Hey,
Yeah.
congratulations! Hey, happy birthday!" That's a
Yeah.
pretty cool feeling.
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't take that for granted.
Yeah.
It's really cool. Yeah.
Cool. So I have one more question for you before I dive into that. Anything else you wanted to share about what you're doing with IFS? Anywhere people can check you out? Anything else you think, man, people need to know this is going on, or this is a piece of wisdom I want to share before we ask your final send off question?
Well, I mean, I think we outlined a lot of stuff we didn't get to. And, I think that's fine because there's no way we could possibly tackle it all. I think that a lot of what we did talk about is, really core to the conversations that I'm having on a regular basis. So, I just was talking to someone recently about how often it feels like I'm stating the obvious, in podcast conversations. And he's like, yeah, that's because the statement is easy. The execution of it is so much harder. And that is, really where we're at. When you think about a lot of what is happening in the space now, AI is an exception because it is new and it's rapidly evolving. But a lot of where we are is really around adoption.
Yeah.
There isn't some next big thing right now. It's really how much has happened and putting it into action, and that's where a lot of these things get into the nuance of storytelling and curiosity and leadership and all of those things. So really enjoy talking about these things week to week. And I'm sure you guys will let people know, where to find the podcast. The only other point that I wanted to come back to, if it's
Yeah.
okay, is earlier when we were
Absolutely.
talking about change, and we kind of talked about change specifically, but you had also brought up AI.
Yep.
And the one thing that I wanted to say to that, I had a podcast conversation recently with a gentleman who is an author and a thought leader. His name is Faisal Hoke. And we had a conversation about how do you balance the innovation the AI allows with protecting humanity. One of the points that I felt was really powerful from the conversation that I think is a good way to sort of frame how we're thinking about AI is the power of neutrality. And so we talked about how in this big push of AI innovation, you have people that are at extremes. One is they're
Mhm.
resistant or fearful, they're skeptical, and they're probably not moving as quickly as they need to. And that is an issue. But on the flip side, you have people who are very gung ho with maybe not the best of long-term intentions. So it's like, oh, we could optimize everything, we could automate everything, we can get rid of
Yeah.
600,000 headcount, whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
And there's going to be repercussions of that as well, right? And so we talked about how maybe what's best is to not allow yourself to incline toward either of those extremes, but rather to kind of try and stay centered in this idea of neutrality. And you had said something when you brought up AI about, understanding sort of where and how. And I think if you can frame it in that way, it helps to really keep focus on, like, what is our core value proposition? What is unique and different about what we do? What do we need to do to protect that? And what does that mean in terms of the skills and roles that we have to have?
Yeah.
And then let's look at everything else that could change. But like, let's protect this bit, right? And then let's kind of go from there. But I really liked the point about the power of neutrality and not getting swept up in either the fear or the greed, really, is what it comes down to.
Oh my gosh, Sarah, I'm so glad you brought that point up because we didn't talk a lot about AI, and it's critical, right? It's SEO is gonna love it, and our producer's gonna love it. Like, we can put this in the tag, right? But that being said, man, that's such a I haven't heard anybody frame it that way, right?
Yeah.
Neutrality, like, it's pausing, and I hear that, and I think organizations need to pause, and I can't think of a better way to put it than say protect our value, protect the things that make us who we are, right? And not rush to, can we eliminate that entire function? Because
Yeah.
organizations who are running fast don't know the pitfalls they're going to run into yet, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
and the risk and I think it's okay to go fast if you're going fast with intention and
Right.
meaning,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And that maybe is the title of this episode. I don't know, like neutrality and the impact of AI. Like, even though that's a little piece of what we talked about, but
Yeah.
my gosh, I
Yeah.
love. Is there an episode, that episode specifically? What number is that? What can you share that with us so we can link it down? Because I would
Yeah, of
love to
course.
make sure our audience can go find that specific episode on top of everything else. Because now that I
Yep.
want to go listen to
It
that
was
specific episode.
313. But yeah, I can share it with you for sure.
313. We have a long way to go to catch up, Sarah.
You don't have to start at the beginning.
We're gonna have to have you on later and talk more just about this topic as you
Yeah.
continue to dive into these conversations in this
I wrote
space.
an
Like,
article for today too that I don't have all the answers, and I never
yeah,
pretend to. Like I
yeah,
just said, like, that's part of the problem, right? Is if you wait until you have it all figured out to share a thought, I mean, no one would ever be sharing thoughts,
yeah,
really, right? The thing that I've been thinking about, and honestly, it came up for me a few weeks ago. I was flying through Newark when they had one of their big recent blow ups. No, that was a bad, whatever. Let's not, we'll
yeah,
cut that out. Kerfluffles with the air traffic control. And
yeah,
I was very on edge because they had so many issues that week. And I was like, I don't even know if I'm going to get a flight out of here or what have you. And I was reading some of the articles written about it and thinking about the idea of technical debt, right? And how the AI era is really compounding that problem for a lot of organizations because there's a lot of reasons that you have technical debt. Anyone could think of a dozen off the top reasons to delay,
yeah,
prolong, squeeze out another year, 3-5 years of this system, et cetera. But the constrictions that that's going to put on companies that are not only now having to get up to speed in whatever way they're, beholden to a legacy system, but then try and, catch up on the AI front, I think it's going to present a really big problem for a lot of people.
yeah. And Robert Half's the sponsor of this show, and they talk about that a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Technical debt is one of the trending topics in the latest like 3 or 4 different reports they have, and I think you're spot on, right? Organizations who want to leverage these things are realizing, oh, we held on to that version of the application for 3 years too long, and now we can't implement things that are really going to drive value because we're not
Mm-hmm.
there,
Yeah.
right? So I think that's spot on. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for the time
Mm-hmm.
today. Before I send you off, the final question that I ask every guest, and I can't wait to hear your answer. I think it's going to be really good. If you could hit rewind, you pulled an Adam Sandler, got a remote, hit click, you rewind. You pick a time in your life, younger Sarah. What words of wisdom or advice would you give to younger Sarah?
So I don't want to let you down in my answer, but I honestly think it would go back to the point I made about just be yourself. Be yourself.
Mm,
Trust yourself. You don't have to try and be something you're not to be successful. You don't need to, try and fit into any certain mold. You can do it your way and it can all work out. So I think that would be the thing that I would most benefit from hearing, many, many years ago.
Whether you believe it or not disappointed with that answer at all.
Okay, good.
Fantastic advice. Be yourself, be the authentic you, and make an impact while you do it. Appreciate your time, Sarah. Again, thank you so much for all your wisdom. We will catch you on the next episode of Bytes and Banter.